Good evening. Good evening to everyone here and to more than 50 people that we have registered online. I am so excited. And it's really exciting because contrary to the usual Presbyterian worship attendance, everybody's like in the front and center. It's refreshing, actually. Thank you. I'm Reverend Amy Moore, and I have the privilege of welcoming you to North Park Presbyterian Church, and on behalf of the Social Justice Task Force of Grace Presbytery, to this conversation this evening for the accommodation. A couple housekeeping things. The usual important is restroom. When you exit the sanctuary, take a right, go almost to the glass doors and turn left, and you'll see the restrooms on your left as well as a water fountain. They were handing out 3x5 cards on your way in so that you may write down questions as you have them as the conversation unfolds, and there will be a Q&A period afterward. If you did not get a card and would like one, raise your hand. There are pens in the pews. And for our friends online, if you can access the chat box, I invite you to put your question in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get that forward as well. So when you have your questions, pass them to the center aisle where they'll be collected and brought forward. Lastly, as you take out your phones to silence them, make a note in your calendar for Tuesday, October 24th. More information will be coming out about this, but we will be featuring an online event with Reverend Deanna Hollis, who will be presenting Unmasking the Powers Behind the United States Gun Violence Epidemic. I hope you might join us for a very informative session. All right. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung said, "Until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate." Let me say that again. Until we make the unconscious conscious, the unconscious, will direct our lives and we will call it fate. This book, the discussion this evening, is sure to challenge our unconscious patterns. So I thank you, we all thank you for being here, willing to accept the challenge so that we might become more conscious and choose to live in unity for a more healthy future. With that, I'd like to take a moment to begin in prayer. And as is my usual pattern, I invite you to take a breath. Settle in your seat and release your distractions. Breathe in gratitude for this place, this time, this moment to be present. Holy God, open our ears, break open our hearts for healing that comes in unexpected ways and the imaginative pathways of creating a new future. We give you thanks. Amen. So I'd like to begin with introducing our moderator for this evening, Reverend Christopher Lee on your left. Chris is our General Presbyter of Grace Presbytery. If you have not met him before, he is married to his college sweetheart, Brandy, and they have two daughters, Erin and Jordan. And I just have to throw in that he proudly bears the title of a nationally ranked junior tennis player and earned an NCAA Division I scholarship to Howard University in Washington, D.C. With all the degrees and schools that Chris went on to attend, of note, after he received his Master's of Divinity from Union Presbytery Seminary, all the positions that he has held, he has been the first African American for that position. So, Chris, lead on.
Thank you for that. You all certainly aren't here to hear from me tonight, so it is my proud honor to introduce our distinguished panel, who I have been told to refer to as Your Honor and Most Beautiful Queen. This evening, thank you all for being here. It's so good to see all of you in person. Tonight we welcome first Jim Schutze. Jim is a writer and journalist in Dallas. He is a recipient of the National Association of Black Journalists Award for Commentary, the Association of Alternative News Weekly's National Award for the Best Commentary twice, and Lincoln University's National Unity Award for writing on civil rights and racial issues 3 times. In 2011, Jim was admitted to the Texas Institute of Letters in recognition of his career as a journalist and author. He was a columnist for D Magazine in 2020, a columnist for the Dallas Observer from 1998 to 2020, Dallas Bureau Chief of the Houston Chronicle from 1996 to 1998. From 1978 to 1991, he was the Metropolitan Page columnist for the Dallas Times Herald. In the early 1990s, he wrote 6 nonfiction books, including The Accommodation, The Politics of Race in an American City, and Bully, which was the basis for a controversial film directed by Larry Clark. 2 of his books were finalists for the National Edgar Allan Poe Award for crime writing. Let's take a moment to welcome Jim. Now, you have an extensive history in Dallas. I have to ask you, who's your football team of choice?
The Lions, of course. Okay.
Good man. All right. Our next guest is the Reverend Virzola Law. Reverend Law is a 4th-generation member of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. She holds a bachelor degree in mathematics from Jarvis Christian College, attended Bright Divinity School, and received her Master of Divinity degree from Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa. Reverend Law is the first elected female and African American to serve in the role of senior pastor at the historic Lindenwood Christian Church in Memphis, and now at our neighboring Northway Christian Church. She is passionate about building bridges in divided communities and doing the work of developing anti-racist churches. Her zeal for radical hospitality overflows into her enjoyment of life with family, notably 2 grandchildren, and friends through a good book, traveling, and sitting by the ocean. And having had the privilege of serving in worship with her, she can preach. Something serious. Let's take a moment to welcome her. So the first question for you, Jim, is what led you to write The Accommodation?
I came here from Detroit in 1978 to take a newspaper job. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Northern College, Yankee liberal town. There was a street down the middle of Ann Arbor called Division Street, and everybody on one side was black, and everybody on the other side was white. My dad's church was on the white side of Division Street. And I mention that just to make sure that you know that I know that white racism and segregation are not unique to the South. We white folks have managed to share it around really equally. It was a big issue in my dad's church and sort of in my growing up in Ann Arbor. And then later, as a young man, I was a reporter in Detroit in the 70s, in my 20s. I came to Dallas, and that's when everybody was coming here. The Sun Belt phenomenon was the biggest demographic shift in the history of North America, and Dallas was the bullseye for a lot of it. And I felt that I was bumping into something that was shockingly different. I don't mean different from, even different from the rest of the South. I'd spent some time in Atlanta and Montgomery and around, and I talked to other people who'd come, including Southerners, including the guy who was the editor who thought up this book, a white guy who grew up in Birmingham, and we agreed that there was just something different here, and it was hard to put your finger on it, except that white people would tell you, especially in leadership positions, Dallas never had any racial issue. Everybody here is happy. And then the common phrase was, our colored people are very happy here. And so watch yourself and don't stir anything up. And I thought, I don't know the history here, I'm not from here, but I know that story is not healthy and not true. And so I wound up writing a book that was really speaking to white people and just kind of saying, look, here's the history of the place. Here's what happened. And now you make up your minds about what needs to happen next.
So what's been your experience? I would ask both as, obviously in the pastoral work you do and the community work you do, what's been your experience in Dallas thus far?
I was listening to you, Jim, and I was born in 1973. So I am the year of hip hop. That was the year of hip hop was born. So if I start rapping, then y'all just beat your heads and we'll go with it. And also born in Houston. And so I went to school in East Texas, which is not Dallas. Went to school in Fort Worth. And for me, it's all close together, but apparently Fort Worth is not Dallas. No laughs from the audience, okay. and so coming, a pastor in Carrollton in the 90s, and so coming back here 5 years ago, my experience of Dallas has been an awakening experience, because I've never been in this part of Dallas. Many of my friends live in Cedar Hill and DeSoto and South Dallas and Oak Cliff, but didn't have friends in University Park in North Dallas. And turns out, when I say the church that I pastor is down the street from North Park Mall, across the street from Sparkman Hillcrest, when I say North Dallas, if I'm at a funeral in South Dallas, African-American funeral of a deacon, or doing some ministry work in South Dallas, people from South Dallas go, oh. And so I was getting that when I came in 2018, last 2018 and 2019. In 2020, I had 3 years, two or 3 years in the pandemic where I didn't really get to get many responses because we were all in a bubble, amen? And so now that I'm coming back out and I'm among people, they're like, oh, like that's a sundown part of town. So I go Google, because though I'm not a millennial, Google is my friend and my research partner. And y'all not gonna laugh at any of my jokes today. And so as I'm Googling and I look up sundown, I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to be in the house by sundown, and definitely not on this part of town. Nobody told this to me on my search committee, by the way. And it's just been part of my gift in my life's work. And so I have found Dallas to be a wonderful southwestern city. By that I mean, as a good Southerner who was born in Houston, but it's really southwestern, Dallas is not Houston. Dallas is also not Southern in the same way Memphis, that I spent 16 years. But the similarities of the Southern kind of hospitality is the bless your heart. The similarities is there's this thin layer of hospitality over a thick layer of hostility. Mm-hmm. And Dallas just dresses it up. And so I still move across spaces and I can tell by the landscaping, I can tell by the schools, I can tell about how people are moving in day and night in the streets, who you are and what color you are. And I'm like, how did this still continue to be the case in 2018, 19, and now in 2023. And I'll continue as I have lived in East Dallas. I've lived near the Park Cities. Now I'm in Carrollton. When I walk around the spaces that I walk around in the city, in those particular places, I've had people to follow me as I walk around places that I pay mortgage and rent. They're not following my neighbors like they follow me.
Right.
These people have uniforms on and cars. Some people call them 5-0, some people call them policemen. And so this was part of my experience of Dallas. Don't mess with Texas. And yet there's these wonderful things that are about Dallas and North Park Mall. There just doesn't seem to be that kind of discrimination. Green kind of goes across the board.
Yeah.
So one of these things are not like the other as I think about Dallas and the different parts and pockets of Dallas, but it's still one city. And so I'm meeting Dallas again. And as I'm beginning to meet Dallas in new ways, it's not just about color, it's about economics. It's not just about economics, it's about housing. It's not just about housing, but it's about accessibility. So whether it's public transportation, as you think about other large cities, and whether it's about healthcare, because I spent a lot of my time as a pastor in the hospital, they're just things that I noticed based on the different parts of town that I find myself. And so the accommodation helped me to understand what I felt in my gut, that we've come a long way, Dallas, and we have a long way to go.
Absolutely. Jim, could you say more about, in your research, where you saw the relationship between race and economics in this city, how those two sort of played off each other?
Well, it had a lot to do with the extreme geographic division of the city and the closing of doors. When I came here, I think it was my first night in town, I reported for work at the newspaper, and then there was a big event on some high-rise downtown announcing a real estate project. And so they had a champagne fountain, and we all went because they would have free alcohol. And so we went from the newsroom. And I got there, I was fresh from Detroit, and I walk in this place, and it is all white. I mean, entirely white, except for the guys serving drinks, who must have been a football team or something, because they were huge. They're big guys, and they were dressed in tuxes, but they were black. And everybody else at the place was white. Somehow I got into, I don't remember how, a conversation. This guy said, oh, you came from Detroit, you must feel like you died and came to heaven. And I wasn't enthusiastic enough. And he said, well, what's your problem? And I said, oh, it's just very different. And he wanted to know how. And I said, well, I haven't been anywhere in a long time, maybe ever, that was this white. So then I got treated to this speech about how happy everybody was, but he was using the N-word to describe how happy everybody was. And these guys are standing around with the drinks, and I had just come from Detroit, and I thought, well, we're going to die.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to signal to this young man with the drinks, I'm not with him, But the most notable memory of it was that young man with the drinks cut me dead. Like, don't look at me, hippie, like you and I are going to be friends or something. There's a system here. There's a wall. And you're on that side, and I'm on this side. And that's how it works. And we don't cross that line. So I think that it was important for me to understand, not that I didn't I understood that black people didn't build the wall, But the wall was there, and it was absolutely rigid, and it was social, but it was also economic. So that businesses were either all white or all black. Everything was separated. If I look at the city now, it's just almost impossible for me to describe how changed it is for the better. If I took young people from Dallas today and stuck them back in Dallas in 1978, they'd think they were in a science fiction movie. They wouldn't understand it. So the city has changed wonderfully for the better. But that division, when people can't even look at each other and talk to each other, that means they can't do business together, they can't bank together, they can't borrow money from each other. So it's the economies are separate, rigidly. And as a last thought about that, one of the lessons I learned from looking at that was when you have two separate economies, they're not two separate equal economies. Somebody's got the good one, and somebody's got the short end of the stick. But that division was just absolute, and it controlled everything, and absolutely controlled business.
Reverend Law, talk to us about the wall. He mentioned this wall, this separate economy. How does that hit you?
It hits me in many spaces as I visit with friends who live and are from the city, and I see the spaces that they occupy. Whether it's the restaurants we go to or the clubs, jazz clubs. I didn't mean to say clubs. The pastor doesn't go to clubs. Let me rewind, press play. The entertainment venues. And so when I see it, how the economy plays out there, I see it as I go to shopping malls. North Park is one, and then Redbird. Oh, there's no Redbird. They had to redo Redbird. So I see it in the way it looks in malls, right? So economy. And for me, the economy of the church. It's still what Martin Luther King says, it's still the most segregated hour, even with the improvement and progression of multicultural churches. However, and many of those churches, though multicultural, are not led by Black people. Said another way, Black people will follow white people don't follow Black people. But then there's Northway Christian Church. And they just decided to find a pastor in their 117-year history that is the most beautiful pastor that has ever served there, who's been kissed by the sun that long. And so the economy, how we exchange not just finances, but the economy of time, right? How we exchange the economics of a relationship. That the church still has not fully dealt with race into the wake of George Floyd. Out of sight, out of
mind.
And so the importance of the Christian church in race conversation isn't going away. It's gotten bigger. In the book, there were examples all over the spectrum of white and Black and liberal and conservatives, and it's based on their own ideologies. It's not based on the good news. I'm not even in the interfaith conversations, just the Christian spectrum. And it doesn't get to the heart of the liberating love that we know in Jesus Christ and the way the Spirit empowers us. It doesn't get to the full inclusion of the Imago Dei, those who are created in the image of God, and how race gets dismissed. So when people tell me things like, I don't see color, I'm like, I've been kissed by the sun too long for you not to see color. In fact, what I discovered in many of my friends in Dallas and otherwise, my white friends, is I'm like, y'all trying to get my color now, hanging out, getting tans. So the history of Dallas and the way it's tokenized economically Black people, that I think that we need to find intentional spaces, particularly in the church like today, to listen, to grow and reflect. I want to quote a piece from the book. It was when the Black struggle moved beyond tokenism that the real white resistance began. And it began with the realization that what was afoot was fundamental social and political change, not mere ceremony. That is to say, when Black people moved into certain neighborhoods, then you get white flight, Oak Cliff. When you get Black people moving to certain economies, you get flight. People leave malls. And so that economy is, I'm chasing this dollar, trying to understand why do people move and why have they shifted? One of the things that I discovered is, as a Black woman in particular, that one of the things of Black girl magic is it makes people disappear. Because you have to deal with the ways in which our systems of these fragile United States, which is still a big, grand experiment, will cause people to leave because we don't want to deal with what happened. Bodies were stolen. We could talk about immigration. We can talk about others who chose to come here. Bodies were stolen from the continent, beaten, taken through a middle passage through the transatlantic. And so we find ourselves in these yet-to-be United States and won't reckon with what was done and all that's impacted. And the accommodation exposes that. And I think the church, the economy of the church and the economics of what was built by people, and Black people in particular, we won't even get to the Native American conversation, what continues to be stolen? And how do we make accommodations that end up robbing person's humanity?
Thank you for that. This question is for both of you. One of the things I've often heard, in a way, or either directly or indirectly, is keep your politics away from my Jesus. We're in a church, and we're talking about social issues, history. Why do you think it's important to talk about this stuff in a church? Is it appropriate or is it not?
I want to go first as the youngest because I want to listen to the PK. He's a pastor's kid. I heard recently something that really helps me think about this. It is Pastor Sloan from Houston said this, and I'm going to try it out on you to see if it works. As I think about the politics, particularly the spectrum, we have the Republicans and the Democrats, or we have the elephant and the donkey. If you think about them in those terms, or this left and right. As Christians, what if we introduce a new animal to the spectrum to have a conversation that doesn't so polarize us? What about the lamb? What's the role of the lamb in our conversations? How might we take seriously our faith and hear what God is saying to the church now and not let these polarizations govern our lives and tear this world apart, because we're heading for another civil war if we don't. And so neither the extreme left or the extreme right can take over what God has given us in Jesus Christ and as the body of Christ. But this lamb is calling us to a place, and for me that place is in the middle. It's purplish, which most of us really live. The older I get, I feel a little bit more conservative. But then I have these younger ones, and I'm like, I want to be a little bit more liberal. I wanted to go hang out at the Beyonce concert with everyone else.
Me too.
And so I wonder politically if we don't allow the donkey or the elephant, but we allow the lamb to call us to, because I'm scared as all Dickens of 2024. Can I be honest? As I think about what God has done, and there's nothing new under the sun, every 500 years there's a reformation, and we're about 8 years into it to celebrate it in October. And I believe that the politics is going to be part of the reformation, because I still believe that the church is the hope of the world. And I still believe when Jesus gave Peter those keys, upon this rock, I'll build my church. And not even the gates of Hades, not even the strongest politics, not even the most divisive thing will conquer that. And that's the church that Jesus is coming back for. So just tried that out on you. Not the elephant or the donkey, but let's get to the lamb.
I think it's hard for all of us to know exactly where our hearts are at any given moment on a lot of these issues, and we sort of need a compass. I had a conversation just this week with Kelvin Walker, who is just in and of himself kind of a miracle for me to deal with. Kelvin Walker is the CEO of the Dallas Citizens Council. The Dallas Citizens Council is the group that got my book suppressed in 1986. But the guy who got the book suppressed did not look or sound at all like Kelvin Walker. For one thing, Kelvin Walker is African American. He's from Atlanta, and he's a very thoughtful guy. And we were at an event together, and as we were leaving, he just casually was talking about this thing of what we really believe and what we really think. And he said one of the tells that he hears in people is when you're talking about children. He and I were talking about school reform, and kids, and teaching kids to read and so on. And he listens for whether, and he's listening to both white people and black people, for the phrase, their kids. He said, how can you look at children and see them as their kids?
Right.
Why wouldn't you see all children as our kids?
Yeah.
And doesn't that tell you something when someone can other children?
Yeah.
I think, I hope I hadn't just written something on Substack a week before talking about their kids. I don't think so. But I do think we do need a third point, a little test we can give ourselves to sort of quietly see where we are on these issues.
Yeah.
We can all drift wrong at any given moment, but we need a way to get back right.
As you say that, part of what I used to think when I said yes to the call to ministry, I was going to go change the world. Do I have a witness? You remembering those young budding, it's going to change the world. And in my mid-30s, I said, I'm going to just change my church so my church can change the world. And in my 40s, and now that I'm in my just turned 50, I'm trying to change me. One relationship at a time. Because I have a 3-year-old grandson. Right now, he's real cute. But in a couple of years, they're going to build systems about this black boy. The prison to pipeline work tells you this. That they will make decisions based on how he reads if they're going to build a prison cell for him.
That's right.
My 6-year-old granddaughter, they will build prison cells. She's just 2 years from that, based on her reading level. Not just mine, but all of our kids. So how do we humanize? How do we humas? In the beginning, when God created everything, God's intentions in Imago Dei was called it good, and when God created human beings, it was very good. How does the church get back to seeing the very good in every image of God? And so for me, I wonder in this compass, going with this compass analogy in this third way, how we might allow our children, because the decisions I make now are not for me, and it's not even for the whole world. I'm doing it for the children now and the children yet unborn. It's not even just about me anymore.
I know that young people, my son is in his late 30s, and he and his wife really hate it when I say, oh, you young people are going to figure this out. They say, thanks a lot. Why didn't you figure it out? But I can't help being sort of stunned sometimes by how much farther down the road young people are, and I can't help finding hope in that. I interviewed a young guy who grew up in Frisco. He was in his 20s. Actually, he was sort of interviewing me. He was working for a TV network. He had gone off to live somewhere else, and he was coming back to town to work on this project. But he grew up in Frisco when it was already a big, booming, affluent suburb. And he said all the kids he went to school with were from everywhere, from all over the world, much more diverse than you'd ever find in the city. But his dad was an old school racist. So when he said when he was about 8, his dad called him and his sister in and said, you kids are bringing all these colored kids home, and you act like they're our equals. And you need to understand that we are white, and that makes us better and smarter. And so this guy told me as an 8-year-old, he's listening to this speech, and he's thinking that his best friend at school, David, is like 5 times smarter than he is. And he thought, I must not be white. and I thought, I said, okay, now you're in your 20s. What do you think? And he said, no, I wasn't. Whatever my dad thought white was, I wasn't that because nobody is. That's not a real thing. And I thought, how amazing, how amazingly different from my generation, which isn't saying much, but I mean, this guy's even ahead of my son's generation, I think. And I think that's an enormously hopeful thing to watch.
Yeah, it is. And those stories, they are endearing and they give me hope too. And the systems that are baked in make it difficult for me to fully go there until enough of those, what's his name? What's the guy's name?
Oh, the kid? The young man? I don't remember.
Yeah, the young man. Until that happens more and more. And it's because of your book. I mean, when you read the stories, I want to read a story to you. Black woman named Charity was tied up and got 100 lashes for asking Mr. Baird to spare her child, who was being flogged. Also whipped for begging that her daughter might be protected from the constant ravishing of a favorite black man or Baird's place. A black woman complained to the bureau that her white employer had beaten her. No provocation, incapacitating her for work for several days, knocked her down and whipped her. White woman named Miss Cora was accused of attacking her black servant Lizzie, struck her on the head with whip, handled heavily loaded with lead, laying the scalp open. Mr. Menser, white, was accused of attacking Ned, black, knocked him down, held a revolver to his head while another whipped him. Mr. Coleman, white, was accused of killing Kate, black, beat her over the head with a revolver, died from effects of punishment. The record shows that no action was taken in any of the above cases, either by civil or military authority. Reading your book, Jim, made me have to go to therapy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Reading your book made me have to go visit my doctor because of what was happening in my body. I wonder how reading this affected you. There were parts I would read and I would have to reread. And so I wonder if an invitation for that young man to read it, because we don't know what the black kids or the Asian kids or the other kids in Frisco are having to do just to show up, to be in those places so that they can begin to move that needle, right? I needed to read that book, and books like yours are now going to be banned from places because we don't want to face our history, because we don't want to face ourselves. So I found your book to help me know what was already in my body. I just needed therapy to figure out, why did I cover all this up? Because we were taught to be so accommodating. We, meaning African Americans. And so I was so grateful for your courage to write, because it's causing me to do my own healing so that I'm a disciple and we have communion every Sunday. And so that when I think about the table of our God and the role of the church, that this is a table, that this even is a world. It's not your world, it's not my world. This is God's world and God's creation. And so how might we create a space at the table where when we hear stories, we don't rush past them? That as you hear how I read this story, that perhaps the next story we read as we read about immigration, or the stories that we read as we hear about slavery, or the stories we read as we hear about women being treated, or the stories that we read and we see, and not just on social media, but the stories like you write, real stories about LGBTQIA, that it might make us pause and feel it in our bones and respond to the Imago Dei differently. So your book has been life-changing for me, but I'm going to send you my therapy bill.
I'm protected from litigation by an old rule of South Texas law called the rule of no dinero. So, yeah, the stuff you're reading was the bulletins of the Freedmen's Bureau sent back to Washington, and those were the same all over the country, and they were too consistent and similar to think that anybody was making it up. And boy, I did not come across those on my own. I was not a trained historian, and there were a couple of people working in the Dallas and Texas collection at night at the downtown, in the same room where I was working, who during breaks I explained my project, and then they must have talked to each other and decided, this guy has no idea what he's doing. And so they came to me and said, you got to get out of these secondary sources, and we're going to show you how to find primary sources. Those were, the technology then was that those came in rolls of microfilm from the Library of Congress on loan to the library here, and I read them in one of those machines, and it was just absolutely devastating. I mean, my parents were Roosevelt liberals. I was a hippie liberal. I thought I had a get out of jail free card on this stuff. And I came to these reports and just scrolling them, and I thought, so I have no idea, I have no inkling of what slavery was.
Yeah.
And none of us do. None of us. It really explained to me the suppression of the book when it happened.
Yeah.
It was pulled off the presses the day it was to run. And I knew exactly who had gotten it pulled off. It was a guy named Alex Bickley, who was then CEO of the Citizens Council. And I called him up, and we were friendly enemies. And I said, Alex, did you get my book killed? And he got him, went, damn straight. And I asked why, and first he said it was because I was trying to stir up racial trouble among black people by telling them all this stuff. And I said, Alex, who do you think my sources were? The black community knows all this stuff. They didn't forget the bombings or the Klan running the city. And so as we spoke, I realized, no, that Alex doesn't care about black people reading this book. Alex doesn't want white people reading this book. So this is a story that must not be told to us, to white people. And, given the passages you just read, you can see why there would be a reluctance to stare directly into it.
There's another fascinating one. The terror among the black families that had ventured onto white turf had become thick and tangible, like illness, but they kept buying houses.
Yeah.
And my parents were born in the 30s and still alive. They're in Houston. And mom and dad both broke color barriers in education, in military, and in government. Dad was in Social Security Administration, mom teaching, and dad in government. And I remember asking my dad the question that my now 6-year-old granddaughters asked me: why do they hate us so much? Mm-hmm. And so my dad had me to begin to memorize scripture, to memorize the Constitution, to memorize poetry. Like, my white friends weren't having to do this. So I had a whole other education when I got home because I was told I had to be 2 or 3 times better than my colleagues in elementary and middle school, because I was in integrated schools at the time, in the 70s and 80s. And I realized that I didn't have the luxury of feeling safe. My parents helped me understand it wasn't going to be safe. I was going to have to do this scared.
Yeah.
I was going to have to do this brave. But it has been the conversation with my white members and congregations and my white friends that when they hear the stories and hear my struggle, it humanized both of us. And so what I hear you saying in that, it is like, literally, how do we humanize? We all ain't nothing but dirt. Mm-hmm. With the finite amount of time, with the Ruach, the very breath of God in each of us, what are we going to do with that space and time? And so the accommodation and your boldness is the kind of bravery we all need to hear and read the stories, because they are where truth is.
I'm not taking any points for courage. Mm-hmm. I was a journalist, a writer. Mm-hmm. I wanted to write a book. Mm-hmm. I wrote a book. I don't know how much courage that takes. I was so struck by the kind of courage you're talking about. After the book came out, I ran into a woman whose house had been bombed, and I wanted to hear the story. So I went to her house, which she still lived in. And she was old by then. It was bombed when she was young, in the late 50s, in old South Dallas. Mm-hmm. And her story was that the front end of the house was blown off. She and her husband were in bed. It was a new house. They just bought it. And the front end was blown off the house with dynamite. And her husband was injured. His leg was hurt, but she wasn't injured. So she staggers out to the front of the house, and there are firemen who've come into the house, and they've asked, was anybody hurt? It just happened. And I remember, I'm sorry, I left out an important element. I asked her if she had reported this to the police. What was the role of the police? So when she staggered out into the front of the house and all this smoke and din, the fire department was there and the cops were there in her house. And she looked at me and she said, what do you mean, did I report it to the police? The police were in on it. They were there when it happened. And when I told them that my husband was injured, they said, okay, we'll call the colored ambulance, which they did. So anyway, she told me this story, and as I drove off, I thought, wait a minute, she's still in that house. Somebody blew the front off her house, and the cops and the fire department were in on it, and she's still living in that house. What kind of courage does that take? To say, this is my house, I'm going to fix it, and I'm going to stay here, and we're going to pay off this mortgage.
Right.
That's remarkable.
The courage means with heart. And so while you don't have that kind of courage, the heart to write it and to come back and to say the why. Like, what is your why? And us each to ask, what's our why to sit in this audience, to be online, to dig around into stuff that just didn't get talked about. I thought I was giving my daughter a better world. I thought I was giving my grandson a better world. I never imagined a Sandra Bland. Mm-hmm. I never imagined a George Floyd. Like, that's not in my imagination. I just thought we were so much better than that. So whether we're talking about Minneapolis or we're talking about Dallas, there is a place that takes a kind of bravery for each of us to say that enough is enough. And so for that woman to go back to that house, mm-hmm. for us to look squarely at January 6th mm-hmm. and that insurrection, and for us to say, not on my watch. I mean, that's the line that I believe that the church is going to have to draw now. That we have to create an enough and enough is enough line. Because another part from the book that I was like, as we're getting ready for the fair, I got to find my notes. We're getting ready for the fair, and I'm like, okay, there's integration now, no more segregation, except for like there's a colored day and then there's like a KKK day. Like, what is that? Mm-hmm. And so it's a little bit triggering that this fair time is coming and knowing how that was accommodating. And even when there was the colored day or the end day, there was no restaurants they could go to. Today, there are places that people can't go because of the economics, but there's also places they can't go because the transportation system. Mm. We think about South Dallas now, and the work that Northway Christian Church is doing with Greater Garth Community, AME, African Methodist Episcopalian Church, African Methodist, AME, is a garden, because what they have taught us as we who are North Dallas Church working to build bridges with the South Dallas Church, we know that that bridge has to come both ways. And they have exposed us to the fact that people who live in that community, because there are not good grocery stores there, it's an hour and a half to commute to one by different buses, an hour and a half back, so it's 3 hours just to commute to, but that's not even the grocery store time. Then you got to carry the groceries. That's not a food desert as we think, because in desert, things grow. That's a food apartheid. Structural systems built in this amazing city that has been not addressed. There's a role for the church to play in that. And so as I think about where do we go from here after we hear all of this information, to really start with poverty, to look at housing, to look at education, to look at our healthcare systems, so that we might move this accommodation, because I feel like we're moving to accommodation 2.0, but I want to keep my church and my job, so I'm not going to tell you why I said that. But it has to do with a certain shift that's happening now in our city. And if we're not careful, we'll be there again.
So both of you have talked about the challenges, the history, but I think you've both alluded to hope. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. While recognizing that there's still these systems, and that's a word sometimes that I think people I've experienced get really lost in and struggle with. What do you mean systemic? Mm-hmm. What does that mean? So in the context of your work, your research, to what extent we've made progress, mm-hmm. but to what extent are you concerned about the systems that are in place and are building mm-hmm. to marginalize communities of color?
I've talked about the book on several occasions in tandem with Dallas County Commissioner John Wiley Price, who wrote the introduction. And often at the end of a meeting like that, somebody will ask me, do you think things are getting better? Or do you think things have gotten better? And so my little speech is about, yes, how amazingly better, how amazingly changed. The CEO of the Citizens Council isn't Alex Bickley anymore, it's Kelvin Walker. And I talk about all the things that seem remarkably better. The more I talk, the more I can see Commissioner Price. He does this thing where he starts having back trouble or something. And then he says, okay, I'm not going to argue with Brother Schutz's story here about how much better things are, but I just want to leave you with the fact that there is a United States Census tract in southern Dallas where a child born today will die 23 years sooner than a child born in Frisco. And he said, while you're patting yourselves on your back for how much better everything is, ask yourself how you can live with that. How can we live with this sort of slow-rolling holocaust of children? The kids didn't get to decide where they were going to be born. And so I try to hold both things in mind at the same time. I think it's a mistake to deny the progress we've made. And it's a mistake not to see how much farther along young people are than I am. But Commissioner Price is not wrong. We have things in our midst that are difficult even to contemplate.
Yeah, it is. What I hear in his response to you and what I feel in my body right now, it's the generational poverty. It's the generational lack of access to a thing. And so one generation might, but then a lot of them might move from Dallas. So it's like starting over. You've heard that, you've seen that scratch line, you've done that exercise. It's further to go. One of the pieces that you write, people have got to learn how to reach out and form coalitions around issues, Price says. That just doesn't happen yet in Dallas, and it has to happen. People have to learn how to identify areas of mutual interest and coalesce around them before we can move ahead and begin to solve a lot of the major problems before us. He's arguing for finding something around mutuality. I'm on a council group of clergy with the Dallas police chief. And one of the things that he told us, he gets here and he was like, whoa, this city is wonderfully awful. It's wonderful and it's awful. Both are true. Like we live in this paradox.
Yeah.
Not paradise. It's paradoxical. There are some amazing things here. Yes. And when he realized that the way our highways are laid out and the infrastructure, there were no theaters that were up and running within a circumference of a certain area. The ones that were closed down. He said, where they do that? I can't say it in his Puerto Rican accent. But he's like, where do they do that? Like, you have children that leave here. You have teenagers. How do you not have movies, entertainment? This is in the pandemic, right? He's like, so now we've lost more movie theaters. Kids don't even have a safe place to go for 2 hours. So what do? They go to car washes that are by liquor stores that are near drug dealers. That's systematic. Like, who thought that out? Well, my friends, whether they were black or white, my friends in Frisco, my friends in Allen, they're like, we chilling, we hanging out, we're having a great time. Their children are fine.
Yep, all right.
Right? So that's what he's saying. I mean, that's the real life story. Like, so part of the solution, to not stay in the problem side of it, the police chief said, I got to find some people who will help me set up a movie theater. And so someone said, hey, I'll buy the screen, I'll buy that. They didn't know it was going to be $100,000. But people begin to coalesce around, let's get the children from the closed down car washes near the liquor stores, and let's at least get them to a safe place of entertainment, because they're already left home alone. They already are malnutrition because they're not getting that kind of food in the summer. They're already suffering, as we all did during the pandemic. And so I think as we hear these stories, to believe them and to find a way forward where we can both hold the positive movement of our progress forward, but to not ignore the generational ways in which Black people and brown people have a kind of stuckness, because we have made this accommodation where there is this, it's not just a wall, it's like cement, right? It's like there's no bridge. And so with your work and with other work, it is to face that history in such a way that we can answer my 6-year-old's question. She's learning about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And she said, did you know one of the fundamental needs? And I said, well, Ava, what does fundamental mean? She said, well, we're going to have fun at the mentals. 6-year-old. That basically just food, shelter, just belonging. I mean, until you get to the high part, her naming that. 6-year-old. And so Price, me, and others are saying to all of us, believe Black people when they say this is hurting. I might have arrived, but my daughter, because of all the ways in which I had to do these extra, didn't have the kind of time with me, because I was busy getting this education and this education. I'm not just saying that about Black people, but when you add race and when you add gender to these things, right? And so I think that Price offers a valid critique to hold that intention.
Well, I noticed at some point, I've been really interested in school reform.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get into the weeds about why or how that happened, but I was so struck by the fact that we now people can go in and take kids in the toughest circumstances with everything going against them and bring them to full, fluent literacy by the end of the 3rd grade and change the entire arc of that kid's life.
Right.
And what I noticed was that my conservative white friends would all say to me, well, you can't do anything for those kids until you repair the family. My liberal white friends would say, you can't do anything for those kids until you end poverty and racism. And so we're all agreed, can't do anything. So we're off the hook, might as well go home now.
Yeah.
And it's a lie. It's not true. We can do things. We have things right in front of us that we can do that can change these kids' lives. And so it seems so important. What I hear when I hear us white people saying we can't do anything, I hear that wall.
Yeah.
I just hear othering.
Yeah. Yeah.
They can't be us.
Yeah.
And we can't be them because we are different critters.
Yeah.
And what the school reform thing says to me is, no, we're not different at all. And babies are miracles. And babies have huge brains. You can't stop them from learning all day long. And all we have to do is get into them and teach them how to read. Is that so bad?
I learned a new word called ecotones. Ecotones. And I'm trying to find, is there this, again, I'm going to this place in the middle that's neither where the conservative friends you described or the liberal friends, but something that doesn't exist on both sides. This school reform is part of what exists in the middle. My concern is, what is their nutrition? What is their health care? Because it's so systematic, so we get them to read, but they're not immunized. If we don't get them immunized and they're eating food that's not good for them, it adds up. So what's that space in the middle to take that school reform and thank God, yes, they can have food and we're trying to make sure their food is right, but getting them to the right health care. And then when they're getting home, what I do hear, I mean, like, there needs to be some safety at home because of what they were exposed to. There was, in the pandemic, a friend of mine said that when the pandemic happened, his kids began to text him. He does an after-school program. His kids began to text him. He was like, they said, in South Dallas, an apartment complex, this pandemic is gonna kill us. And he was like, well, wear your mask and make sure you sanitize. He was like, no, the safest time we ever feel.
Right.
So the education system works, the reform works until we get another pandemic or until we get another time of isolation, and the kids are isolated 8 hours a day. So I wanna take that school reform, but I'm like, how do we equip our social workers? How do we create these systems that help to undergird and support what's happening with that school reform?
And as you're talking, I'm thinking of Calvin Walker's point. What if I was looking at kids who didn't have enough to eat? If they go outside, they might get shot. Somebody's going to try to sell them drugs. What if I was looking at those kids and they were my kids
Right.
instead of their kids?
Yep.
What if I thought of them as my kids?
Yeah.
Man, I think I'd be up and at it a little bit. That'd be a call to action.
There's this word I want to share. I don't know if you've heard Ubuntu. And it's a wonderful word that comes from the continent of Africa in the language. They say this, and I want to invite you to say it with me. I am.
I am.
Because you are.
Because you are.
And you are.
And you are.
Because I am.
And I am.
I am. Because you are.
Because you are.
And you are. Because I am. For me to say that in a white church, and to keep saying it as part of our benediction, which means good word, it's for my church to look at this sun-kissed skin Sunday after Sunday, and for them to finally probably really hear, I'm not 3/5 human. Because systems, right, have been baked in. And there's something wrong with her, the way she talks, the way she moves, the way she, there's something fundamentally flawed with me.
Right.
But it's not, because I am, because you are. And that's how we get to this hour that you're talking about. I think it's wonderful to think about if the children become our common peace, and we're gonna fight on how we're gonna get them the peace. But let's begin to, if we can do it for the children, because we all were once children.
Speaking of children, there's a question about children for both of you. How does the language of he, she, they fit with our kids, their kids? Do you see that as unifying or creating more division? That's for both of you.
So are they talking about the pronoun usage, or? I'm going to be honest. These millennials and xennials are stretching me. Everybody just stretch. They're stretching me, just like every generation stretches. And there's something to it, to think about ourselves in this third person and not the singular gendering binary ways. It's fascinating and it's hard. And my associate pastor, Ken Crawford, always says, we're humans, we do hard stuff. If I wasn't in the church, I'd probably say it a different way. It'd be a different S word. We do hard stuff. And so, yeah, as I hear that, it forces me to work through another generation's understanding the imago Dei, like who are we as the created? And how these pronouns has boxed us in, and gendering has boxed us in, and how they're now stretching us to think about one another in a more communal sense, which is the way God talks about God's self in the beginning. In the beginning, when God created, and we hear this we language, and we think about it as in terms of the Trinitarian, but it's a communal sensibility about who God is. And so, yeah, this gendering, I mean, I realize how old I am by how much I'm resisting putting that on my Zoom. It was just what they're asking us to do. And so, yeah.
Thank you. How do you hear that?
Well, my wife and I are both have been journalists, writers, and she was an editor for a long time. And she's a great copy editor and a stickler for grammar. So our son is an entertainer, and he was coming through Dallas. He was living in South Carolina, but he was coming through town in a van with some fellow entertainers and a show that they were doing around the country. And one of the entertainers was a transgendered woman. And so my son came to us first and said he wanted to make sure we understood about the pronouns. And we kept working on it. And my wife was trying to explain to him how this caused a grammatical inaccuracy. And the sentences wouldn't work together.
Right.
And my son is very patient with his parents. So he kept working on it for a long time, and then he heaved this big sigh and he said, "Can you just be nice?" And we said, "Yeah, we can do that." Yeah. And the irony was that the transgendered woman in the group, we thought they were all going to be crazy artists, which they were, avant-garde people. But she was this very southern person from South Carolina who winds up in the kitchen with my wife looking at all my wife's mother's china painting stuff. And they're talking about china painting. Oh my gosh. And now my wife and that woman they correspond all the time. They're best buddies. I'm not sure exactly what the pronoun deal is. I try not to listen, but I can't. What I do, and I recommend this, is to try to sort of look the other way and walk off and talk so they have to figure out who you're talking to.
I have a young adult whose name is Nathaniel, and Nathaniel is she. And so you have what I understand is a traditional male name and a female pronoun, and I mess up all the time. But she sees me like I talk slower, I'm focused. It's the imago Dei for me. It's that image of God, and I so want to honor her, white woman, born male, because I want her to honor me. And in our common struggle, something beautiful has happened. Because when I hear someone else say, Nathaniel, and he said, I was like, she. And so when we become advocates for the other and stop othering one another, something more beautiful can happen. So
thank you for that.
It's a wrestle. It's a wrestle.
Jim, this is for you, but I want to call you back to, Reverend Law talked about needing therapy. One of the questions comes, it says, some of us can't believe that this book was banned. How did you feel? What did that do inside when that happened? And how did you deal with that?
Because of the passages you were reading, the slavery passages, which were shocking to me to come across on the microfilm machine, I was prepared for some kind of blowback. I wasn't prepared for it to. The editor of the book kept calling me up and moving up my deadline, saying, "You got to hurry up," and he wouldn't tell me why. And then he finally said, "We made it. The book is on the presses, and they're going to push the button Monday and print it." And then he called me that Monday morning, shaky voice, maybe crying, I don't know. And he said, they're out in the back shop now pulling it off the presses. It's been killed. And I just felt enormous anger and frustration. And I also thought, this is really dangerous. There's so much that was right about Dallas, and still is right, and still working and happening. And I was from Detroit, and I was in Detroit for the '67 riot. I knew exactly what happens if you just try to bottle this all up. And it's a tremendously powerful and evil thing, and you have to get it out and hope you can get it out and manage it in a way that doesn't burn everything down.
Right.
So I found the suppressing of the book to be scary. This publisher in New Jersey printed 5,000 copies and sent them here, and half of them disappeared in a mysterious warehouse fire. And in the presence of my in-laws, I married a Dallas native. I made the mistake of wondering if I should get a shotgun. And I could see my father-in-law going, he doesn't have a shotgun. He really is a Yankee hippie. And now he's exposing my daughter to this risk. I thought it was scary and it was something that couldn't endure. I didn't know what was going to happen. Of course, the book was republished recently, and that was a fascinating experience, the why and the wherefore for that. It was not my idea, but the suppression of it was a shock to me.
So you talked about the progress. Was there a person or an event that you can point to that was sort of either the seminal person or event or reason for the progress in this city that you can point to?
Only very grudgingly, very, very grudgingly, but undeniably. And it's because he was brought here and put in place by these Citizens Council guys, the ones who suppressed my book. But I have to acknowledge that there was the business leadership and then business leadership. There was the old style, ultra-racist, Colonel Sanders type guys who were going to never move an inch. And then there were a lot of other business leaders, corporate people, not all corporate, locally owned businesses who were doing business all over the country and all over the world. And they were coming back here and recognizing that Dallas had a problem. That Dallas said this wasn't a good place to do business. This wasn't a good place to try to bring investors back. One of them was a man named Bill Solomon, who second generation CEO of Austin Industries. And he was instrumental in bringing Ron Kirk here to be the city's first black mayor. And Ron Kirk, when he became mayor, had the main thing about Ron Kirk as mayor, I didn't agree with him on any local issues, but Ron Kirk, to watch, was amazingly effective. He was very competent. He got things going. He didn't put up with foolishness at the city council level. And all of a sudden, I heard older white people in the city saying, well, you know, that Ron Kirk seems to be quite competent. Like, I'm going to pass out because there's this black man who's doing a great job of running the city. And I think the challenge was never south. Black people knew exactly what was happening and what had to be done. The challenge was north and white. And it was enormously effective for Ron Kirk to be here and to be the mayor in front of everybody where they could see him. And I think I can't put my finger on it, but I have this gut sense that sort of lifted the city up and moved it forward about 20 years.
Thank you. I believe we have about 10 minutes, and we're going to get through all of these questions.
Okay.
So,
All right.
this is for both of you. We've talked about reckoning. Several of the questions deal with this reckoning with history. And in some circles, there's a willingness to engage with history. In some circles, there's a real resistance to it. What history might the church reckon with, and what is the church's role? Where do you see the church's role moving forward, and how to address it?
There's this way, I don't know why Africa is so much in my mind. I was with a group of black preachers, so maybe that's it. But we had this morning in Waco at Baylor this Sankofa experience where it's a bird that whose feet is going forward but who looks backwards. And so one of the ways I want to look backward is a quote from the book. I tell you, I've been reading that. Standing more or less alone between the settled East and Wild West and never enjoying the full trust of either side. Dallas developed a self-conscious fascination with its own character and origin as if it determined to explain itself. The no reason for being myth has almost no kinship with truth. Dallas was founded for precisely the same reason that inspired most of the settlements in the American interior during the westward expansion, because it was at the intersection of major trails and trade routes. And because the people who named and platted it hoped they would be able to promote it, pull in some traffic, and sell their lots at a profit. That intersection and myth fascinated me.
Really?
And there's the myth, and then there's the story, and the Accommodation tells real stories. And so my way forward as a church, my thought forward, if we are indeed at this intersection where the East meets the West, if this intersection as you describe it is true, how can the church be somewhat of an intersection? I think the church is a great place for that to happen. At that intersection, this horizontal and vertical and all the spaces in between at that intersection. How might the church in Dallas, how might we see this intersection and come together for real around this issue of race, around how we might move forward but not afraid to look backwards? Because history repeats itself. And while we don't believe we would call another group to enslave them, while we don't believe that these systems will become as harsh and as dehumanizing, that look at history as the church in the intersection helps us to say never again. And our way forward calls us to have these conversations. And this conversation leads us to another conversation where there's more healing and hope. And that means you got to give up a little something for that to happen. You might have to give up a little square footage. You might have to give up some of the scholarships. You might have to give up so that we can make room. That's what Jesus did.
Making room often makes us uncomfortable. So I think this is a perfect segue to this question for you, Jim. Obviously, one could say that writing this book made room. Did you experience any kind of threats in the production of it, and the research and the writing of it? Did you experience anything because of that?
No, I didn't experience physical threats. Just there was this growing cloud of resistance. I knew that something was going on out there in resistance to the book, but I didn't, the publisher, the editor wouldn't tell me who it was or what it was. And I, even after the book came out, the effect, it was so ironic that they suppressed it, or pulled it off the presses. They did not need to do that. Nobody white was going to read it anyway. And even when it showed up, I found it in one white bookstore at North Park. And it was in the travel and leisure section. And I asked the manager, why do you have it there? And he picked it up and he said, well, it's about accommodations.
It's priceless.
When I told him what it was about, he said, well, in my presence, he pulled it off the shelves and threw them in boxes. He said, I'm sending those back to the publisher. And that was it. It just died. And so, no, I don't have a heroic role for myself as out there facing down the Klan or anything. I just went back to work, and the book was just, it was ignored by white Dallas, and it was read quite closely by black intelligentsia, clergy, business, everybody south. But it was like everything else in Dallas, that there was that division.
For you first, Jim, and then you, Reverend Law, what thought would you leave this group with tonight after our conversation? You.
Well, you asked, what is the role of the church? I was thinking, I was a kid in the 50s. My dad was a minister. He belonged to the Lions Club, the Optimist Club, and we'd get dragged to these luncheons. And my mother was a teacher. She belonged to all kinds of stuff she went to. That's all gone. It's not there anymore. And I look here, I think you're it in terms of public gathering together. Where else are people still physically being in each other's midst? So, I mean, the role of the church, it seems to me, is preserving that candle, because I don't see it anywhere else.
What was the question?
What thought, considering everything tonight, would you leave? What final thought would you leave with the group tonight?
My grandmother, born in the 1920s, died 3 years ago at the age of 98. She, when going to vote, they moved her voting poll place. She was the help, a domestic worker, and her great nieces, her nieces in the audience looking at you, looking at Grandma. Moved her to a different place. She walked there. She took a bus there. You have to vote by a certain time. This is before early voting. There's no transportation. My grandma, Texan, real Texan, did not have a driver's license all the way up to 98. She drove us crazy, but she never had a driver's license. Had a fishing license, and she had a gun license. She's a real Texan. She did shoot a man, but Lord rest her soul. I'm not even Catholic, but... And knowing that helps me be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because just to vote and to be denied and having to bring her poll tax receipt to get the right to vote, only to have to go to another place and then to say that that place was closed, and just the games, that, like knowing how uncomfortable it was just to vote. So it came to early voting, and I tell my mom and dad, I was like, I'm voting early, I'm getting my vote in, and they like to go the day of voting and stand in the line. My parents are in their 80s, so they didn't have the right to vote until they were in their mid-20s. I would leave each of us in the imago Dei of that 98-year-old black woman who would be 103 now. or 101, and that 86 and 83-year-old black man and that 3-year-old black boy and that 6-year-old black girl. And knowing in between them I exist. And right now I'm living in a house with 2 white people in their 60s, full-time. I'm leading a church that's predominantly white. Those are the images I want us to hold and to get comfortable with being uncomfortable with knowing that woman who was denied to vote even though she had the right to vote. To know the work that my parents had to do so that I can do this work. And to promise to build better systems in the church and beyond, so that 3-year-old and 6-year-old won't have to do what that 98-year-old did. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here this evening. The conversation doesn't end or stop here. If it does, what is the point? I hope that you all drive home safely. It has been an absolute pleasure, Your Honor, and most beautiful Queen. You all drive safe and have a great night. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I can't believe you.